Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be watching a video called The Dutch Language, Not Deutsch.
Everyone, welcome to the Lang Focus channel, and my name is Paul. Today's topic is the Dutch language. Dutch is a language that's spoken mainly in Europe, but also in a few other places around the world. It has 23 million native speakers and around 28 million speakers in total, including second language speakers. It is most widely spoken in the Netherlands, where it has around 16 million native speakers. It is also spoken by around 60% of the population of Belgium, mostly in the northern region of Flanders. That's around 6.5 million people. It's also spoken by a small number of people across the border in French Flanders, which lies adjacent to Belgium, but only around 20,000 people there still speak it on a regular basis. It is also spoken in the South American nation of Suriname, where it has around 350,000 native speakers, as well as around 250,000 second language speakers. It is also an official language on the island of Aruba, along with the language Papiamento. But few of the 100,000 people there actually use Dutch, even though they all learn it in school. It is also spoken in Curaçao, where it is spoken by around 15,000 people as a native language and by many of the other 140,000 people as a second language. It is also an official language in Sint Maarten, along with English. A couple of thousand people there speak Dutch, but English is actually much more common.
There is
also Afrikaans, a language spoken in South Africa and Namibia, which is a daughter language of Dutch and is mutually intelligible to some extent. But I'll leave Afrikaans out for now, and I'll speak about it in a different video in the future. Dutch is a member of the West Germanic branch of the Germanic language family, which also includes Afrikaans, Frisian, English, and German, among others. Dutch is one of the languages that is most closely related to English. Actually, Frisian is more closely related to English than Dutch is, but Dutch is a close second.
Really?
And a lot of people say that Dutch is quite similar to German too. In fact, some people say that Dutch lies somewhere between English and German. Now, that's not a very precise statement, but I think there is some truth to it. The history of Dutch. All Germanic languages developed from Proto-Germanic, which was spoken around 500 BCE in northern continental Europe and also in Scandinavia. By the 2nd century CE, it had begun diverging into distinct northern, western, and eastern dialects. The Western dialect is the ancestor of Dutch and of all of the West Germanic languages. Variation developed in the Western dialects, but all of its varieties remained intelligible until around the 8th century CE. But by then, a series of sound changes had begun to take place that made Old High German, the ancestor of modern German, much more distinct from the other West Germanic languages. For more information on German and its history, check out my video on German right here. Old Dutch, also known as Old Low Franconian, remained unaffected by the changes that affected Old High German. Also unaffected were Old Saxon, Old Frisian, and Old English. But those languages underwent a different series of sound changes. But again, Dutch was mostly unaffected by these changes too. Middle Dutch. Old Dutch developed into Middle Dutch, which was spoken and written between 1150 and 1500 CE. It was a rich literary period, and literature from this time period is often quite readable for speakers of modern Dutch, because Dutch is quite a conservative language. Middle Dutch developed into modern Dutch by the middle of the 16th century. The process of the standardization of Dutch began in the year 1477 at the end of the Middle Dutch period. The dialects of Flanders and Brabant were most influential at that time. Then in the 16th century, the move to standardization became stronger, with the Antwerp dialect being the most influential. In the year 1637, the first major Dutch Bible translation, known as
Statenvertaling,
had been published. It had been translated in such a way that people from all over the country could read and understand it. This Bible was read by nearly everyone, and it helped greatly in the standardization of Dutch. The southern Netherlands, now Belgium and Luxembourg, were separate and under Spanish, Austrian, and then French rule. More than half of the people in Belgium spoke a dialect of Dutch, but French was most widely used in public life, in schools, etc. So Dutch remained unstandardized there until the 19th century, when the Flemish movement started standing up for the rights of Dutch speakers. They adopted the same standard language used in the Netherlands. Nowadays, in both the Netherlands and in Flanders, the northern Dutch-speaking region of Belgium, the situation is similar. There are a number of spoken varieties of Dutch, as well as a standard language. So the difference lies mainly in pronunciation of standard Dutch and in the local dialects used. The dialects of Flanders tend to be more conservative and use more older Dutch vocabulary, regional languages. There are Dutch dialects, but there are also different regional languages that are West Germanic languages and closely related to Dutch, but not as closely related as the dialects that are considered part of Dutch. Regional languages in the Netherlands include Frisian in the northern province of Friesland, Low Saxon in the northeast, and there are various dialects of Low Saxon, and Limburgish or East Low Franconian in the southeast. Low Saxon spreads across the border with Germany and forms part of a dialect continuum between Dutch and German. If you've seen my German video, you know that the dialects in northern Germany are referred to as Low German and can be considered a separate language.
Yeah,
the Dutch Low Saxon dialects are closely related to the Low German dialects across the border. This is also true for Limburgisch, which is related to Franconian dialects spoken across the border in Germany. It should be noted that Dutch dialects and regional languages are in decline, with Standard Dutch becoming more widespread, and with some people speaking a kind of combination of Standard Dutch with some dialectal features. So what is Dutch like? Dutch is not mutually intelligible with English, but you will often notice cognate vocabulary, and at the most basic level you will notice similar grammar. If you disregard the details and just look at the most basic sentences. Occasionally there are sentences in Dutch that might be strangely familiar to English speakers. For example,
wat is jouw naam?
This means, what is your name?
Oh, okay.
Mijn naam is Luc.
This means, my name is Luke.
De beer
But it's because they sound the same.
This one means, the bear drank beer. I think I must have gotten that one from Duolingo.
Het is niet ver.
This means, it is not far.
Dat is goed nieuws.
This means, that is good news. Now, if all Dutch sentences were so similar to English, then the two languages could probably be quite intelligible with each other.
But not all of them
most
are
Dutch
like that.
sentences are not that similar to English.
Exactly,
But you will
that's
see
the
a lot of
problem.
cognate vocabulary. Grammar. Similar to German, Dutch is a language that places verbs at the end of the sentence, after the first initial verb. So its underlying structure is basically SOV. But the first verb is in second position, after the subject. So if there's only one verb in the sentence, then it's basically like SVO. Here's a sentence with one verb.
Ik schrijf een brief.
This means I am writing a letter. Word by word, this is like I write a letter. Just like English, with the verb in second position. Here's a sentence with two verbs.
Ik wil je wat lekkers geven.
This means I want to give you some goodies. Word by word, it's I want you, indirect object, some goodies give. In this sentence, the first verb is in second position, but the next verb comes at the end of the sentence. Nouns. Gender.
That is
When it comes to gender, Dutch traditionally has three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. But in modern spoken Dutch, the distinction between masculine and feminine gender has almost become irrelevant because they don't look or sound different. It used to determine which pronoun would be used to refer to those nouns, whether it's he or she, but people generally just use he these days. So now the two genders are basically common
So it's like
gender
it's like
and neuter.
they.
The noun's gender agrees with articles as well as the forms of adjectives. Plural. There are two types of plural endings in Dutch. One is en and the other is s. There are some, well, not rules, but patterns for when to use each one, but there are a lot of exceptions. So you have words like
Deur, deuren, boot, boten.
And you have words like
Sleutel, sleutels, lepel, lepels.
A few neuter nouns have a plural form eren. For example,
Kind, kinderen.
cases. Dutch used to have noun cases similar to German. There were 4 cases: nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. These were part of standard written Dutch until the 1940s, but they were dropped because nobody used them in speech anymore.
But that's so recent. 1940s, that's like what, 60, no,
There are
80
several
years
different
ago?
articles in Dutch. There is an indefinite article,
Een,
and there are definite articles for singular and for plural nouns. For singular masculine,
de,
for singular feminine,
de,
and for singular neuter,
het,
and the definite article for plural for all genders.
de,
An interesting
that's
thing
easy.
is there is a negative article.
geen.
This is the same for all genders and for both singular and plural.
It's like
Verbs.
9,
There
sort
are 2
of,
verb
in German.
tenses in Dutch, past and present, or non-past. But saying there are 2 tenses is kind of misleading because similar to in English, the verb can be used in combination with different auxiliary verbs to express different meanings.
Okay, so
and
that's
there
where
are
it gets
participle
complicated.
forms that can be used to show passive or continuous action. For example, here's a sentence using the simple past.
Hij bouwde een huis.
This means he built a house. So we start with the infinitive,
Bouwen,
and this is the verb stem, and this is the past tense form.
bouwde.
Now here's a present perfect sentence.
Hij heeft een huis gebouwd.
This means he has built a house. So we start with the infinitive,
Hebben,
and here's the verb stem, and here's the past tense.
heeft.
And the second verb is a past participle. This is formed by adding the prefix ge and the suffix.
Okay, like,
the.
this
Notice
is-
again
this is
that
quite
the second
complicated.
verb is at the end of the sentence, even though the first verb is in second
Yes!
position after the subject. There are 3
my
different
God.
ways to express the future tense. One
Are
of
you
them is to
getting
use
this?
this auxiliary verb.
Zullen.
This means something like shall or will.
Ik zal het morgen doen.
This sentence means I will do it tomorrow. You can also use this verb meaning to go
Gaan.
plus the infinitive. This is similar to using going to in English. For example,
Okay,
Het
okay,
gaat
that makes me
regenen.
understand it a
this
little bit
means
better.
it's going to rain. And you can also use the present tense for the future.
Zij komen pas later.
This means they won't come until later. Literally, they come only later. So the verb system in Dutch is rather similar to the one used in English. The main difference being that any verb after the first one comes at the end.
That's so weird.
Pronunciation. One of the hardest parts of learning Dutch might be the pronunciation because there are some sounds that can be a challenge for learners. And native speakers of Dutch seem quite conscious of the challenges we face. That was kind of an indirect way of saying they think our pronunciation sucks. Some of the sounds that require special effort are the Dutch G sound, for example.
Groot.
And the sound which CH often represents. For example,
lachen.
Notice that this is the same sound as the one represented by G.
Yeah, it's the same.
But in other cases, CH represents the sh sound. Now, sometimes those sounds come at the beginning of a word, which is a little bit of a challenge, but sometimes they come right after the letter S, like in the word for school.
Okay.
This sound combination is quite common in Dutch. There are a lot of long words in Dutch. Some of them can be over 30 characters long. Here are a couple extreme examples.
Meervoudige persoonlijkheidsstoornis.
This one means multiple personality disorder, and that is 35 characters long.
Because I'm guessing it says multiple, like the words.
This one means preparation activities for a children's carnival procession, and this is 53 characters long. And Dutch also has a lot of colorful idioms. For example,
maak dat de kat wijs.
This means make the cat wise. This means that someone is saying something so outlandish or unbelievable that even the cat won't believe it.
Oh, okay.
Hij heeft een baard in de keel.
This means he has a beard in his throat. This idiom describes a situation when a boy reaches puberty and his voice starts to change.
He's starting to grow it out.
For English speakers, a lot of Dutch seems strangely familiar, and of course that will help, but there are some issues in learning the pronunciation as well as the finer
I don't know if
details of grammar. But maybe the hardest thing about learning Dutch is that Dutch speakers usually speak English very well, so it will be hard to practice. When you try to speak Dutch with people, they'll probably answer you in English. But you can solve that problem by taking some lessons or doing a language exchange and practicing on your own until you reach a fairly good level and have a fairly good base. Then after that, you can speak to people in Dutch without totally pissing them off.
And you'll still switch to English because you're probably not
The question of the day for native speakers of Dutch: how well can you understand the speakers of regional languages that are related to Dutch, languages like Frisian or Low Saxon? And for people who have studied Dutch, what was your experience with trying to learn and practice Dutch? How did people respond to you? Did they answer you in English? What was the best way for you to learn and practice Dutch? Leave your answers and your comments down below. Be sure to follow LangFocus on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. And thanks again to all of my Patreon supporters for your wonderful contributions every month. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.
Okay, I think it's funny that that thing that he said at the end about like you can practice, but I think Dutch people, because they already know, like most of them, they are very, very good at English, so they'll see you struggling and they'll be like, just whatever, tell me what you need in English, and they'll reply to you in English because they can see that they will able to see that you're struggling. So you really do have to maybe say no please, like in Dutch, because I want to learn. It's like, okay, maybe, and they're gonna be maybe in their brains, or maybe they will tell you like you're a lost cause, like you're not very good at it. But I'm so curious what, like, he also like posed the question, and I was wondering also the same thing, like, do Dutch, like modern Dutch speakers can understand other like related languages like these days, like he said, like low Saxon, I think, and Frisian, like, is it understandable to them? Maybe they because I would think maybe it's not, like, they're not going to be able to like speak it, like they're not going to be able to maybe like, you know, reply to them in that language, but maybe they'll be able to understand them perfectly. Sort of like, I think that's the case with like some languages. Maybe like I think Portuguese and Spanish, something like that. But where that's the case, I think a lot of like Portuguese speakers can sort of understand Spanish, like when people are I think maybe it's because it's written, actually. Like I've heard people say that when they can, like, when like the language is like written, they can definitely understand it. Obviously they're not going to reply in that language because they're like, I don't know enough to actually know the pronunciation, so they'll reply in Portuguese, but you know, they're not gonna like attempt to speak Spanish. I think that's sort of like similar, it's a similar case, but because I'm seeing it like that, and all of the like some expressions that he said, I would think it's the same case. Like, well, yeah, I can understand what you mean. Like, if you're asking me what's my name, like I can understand you. I'm not gonna answer you in German or in Dutch, but I can tell you, like, I can reply to you in English because I'm understanding the words. Only that I don't really know how to. I don't have the words in my brain to actually reply to you in that language. But it's like, yeah, but I think that's the case for few, like he says, well, some of them, but it's like, yeah, the problem is that not all of the expressions and not all the words are like that, so it's not gonna be that easy, because I think it's like misleading to think, oh, everything's like this, oh, like I'll learn like German and Dutch like tomorrow. No, it's not. I don't think it's that easy, even though there are some similarities, I think, in the pronunciation, and some words are like sort of like seem borrowed, so you're gonna have an easier time. But it's not. I think it's a little bit harder than what he's saying. But I can understand like what he's coming from, because he said also like the structure of like the sentences are quite similar between like Dutch and English. So it shouldn't be that hard. Shouldn't. Like I think that's the important part. It shouldn't be that hard. Whether or not you're gonna find it hard, well, that's a particular thing. That's a you thing. But in theory, it shouldn't be that hard, because the structure is quite the same. So you're gonna have an easier time that someone, I don't know, again, like a Portuguese or a Spanish speaker would have, trying to learn this language. I think like that's what I could gather. But it's I think, again, you would have to actually see it in practice to see like how hard and how right he is, because like he was explaining it and it looks a little bit complicated, but obviously because like he was like he's speaking very fast, and you would have to like, okay, hold on, like hit pause and like let me analyze this. But I can gather, like, yes, I can understand what you mean, that the structure is sort of like similar. They have different, the past tense and the future tense, like those are, and the simple past and simple future, like the times are, sort of like they're different. They're kind of similar. Obviously, they have some differences, because again, it's not the same language, but it's sort of like similar in a way. So I can understand, you don't have to completely like switch, your way of thinking to actually understand this. So it's like, okay, I can see why you would think it's a little bit easier. But obviously, I think where it all falls apart, even when you're really good at like, okay, I'm gathering like how can I construct the sentences, how the pronunciation. I think that's probably going to be the hardest, because not just because the specific words, or not words, sounds that he was talking about, like I think it was the yi, like was like ah, or something like that, or the ch that was also ah, or something like that. But apparently the ch can also be like s, so it's like, or like it's a whole thing. And again, I know that English, it's like that as well. Like there are a lot of like, when it comes to pronunciation, a lot of things are not actually pronounced and spoken the way they are written. And I know that a lot of like people that don't really speak English really do complain about it, because it's like, it's actually quite hard, because you're reading the things and then you're trying to pronounce them, but there's not like a rule. Like a lot of things are not pronounced the same. Like, I don't know, like the ph, like it's not always pronounced like that. Sometimes pronounced as f, and sometimes it's not pronounced like that. So I can understand that coming from someone who, like, people that don't really speak English, because I've heard that before. It's like, it can be hard to actually pronounce the English words because there are no rules. It's like, you need to understand it. They need to tell you, oh yeah, like this is like this, especially with indirect and direct verbs. Like it can get a little tricky, but because again, every language has some things. So it's like, well, yeah, you need to really immerse yourself. But I do like that, they're all like, they all stem and they all come from the same sort of, the same antique language. So it is very like, well, yeah, it should be easy. But I think something that I find very curious is that a lot of these things seem kind of modern. Even like the modern Dutch, it's like, apparently, like if you speak Dutch and they'll bring you, like, I don't know, someone brings you a book from like the 1500s, like you'll be able to understand it, because it is, again, it's like old English in a way that, again, you can also understand it. There's always going to be some words that probably you're not going to be super familiar with, but you can definitely read it. You can understand it once you get the hang of like the do, like, means you and stuff. Like once you like get that some nouns specifically, like they weren't like what we use these days. but you can understand it, and I think maybe that's the case as well as with Dutch, that you can understand both things. But it's interesting that he was like, but again, something like it has evolved, because even in some things that were, that people used in the 1940s, they're not used these days. So it's like, oh my God, but 1940s, like that's very recent. Like you probably still have people that were born or were little back in the 1940s and that are still alive today. And are you telling me that they're not really like, oh, people speak very differently from when I was a kid? It's like, it would be quite a trip. I would love someone to like ask them, is it very different? Like, not just like, can you understand, like you would have to switch at some point in your life, you had to switch either the pronunciation or the way you're constructing like your sentences, because people just stopped, using that. I think it was also a thing about informal and formal. People, I think it has gotten more informal with the years, which I think makes sense, because I think in modern times, I think people are less formal with each other. So it makes sense if that's the case. But either way, I think it's very curious that it's like the 1940s, like if you travel back in time and you were a Dutch speaker, like and in the 1940s people would be like, wait, why are you, and you would like start talking and people would be like, why are you talking like that? It's very weird. Or you would just be able to like not understand them at all. I think that, yeah, you can understand them, but it would be a little weird. But again, it's very curious, the whole situation, but also very interesting how language like keeps evolving, because again, like languages are alive, it's sort of like a live organism. They're not an organism, but languages keep evolving, and I think it's very interesting. It's a wonderful thing about human life and with the world. It's like yeah, you can't really help it, because people, they just evolve naturally. It's not a conscious choice. It just happens, and new words are created, people's pronunciation changes, how sentences are constructed also changes. So it is something very interesting. But yeah, that was it for today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.